Welcome again. In our last two episodes, we explored the two key figures often cast as proto-Ashʿarite pioneers, Ibn Kullāb and al-Muḥāsibī. But in today's podcast, we widen the lens. Rather than focusing on individual scholars, we are asking what proto-Ashʿarism really names. Is it a genuine 9th century intellectual formation or a retrospective category imposed on the figures like Ibn Kullāb, al-Muḥāsibī, and al-Qalānisī, who mixed their loyalty to hadith with selective kalam? Set against the Miḥna and its aftermath, these periods saw new struggle over religious authority among the traditionalists, jurists, and the emerging mutakallimūn. So we'll explore whether these thinkers were simply using the rational tools to defend their inherited convictions, or whether they were already articulating an early Sunni theology before Ashʿarism became a school. Along the way, we'll touch on the divine attributes, speech, agency, and the embryonic form of ideas like bilā, kayf, and kasb, while also asking how much of this story is the reconstructions filtered through the latter Ashʿarī and the polemical sources. In essence, we are probing whether proto-Ashʿarism reflects a movement, a milieu, or merely a convenient label in the making of the Sunni orthodoxy. So let's begin our discussion.
Welcome back to the deep dive, where we take these complex source stacks and, really try to distill the essential knowledge you need to navigate the intellectual landscapes of history, philosophy, and religion.
And today we're undertaking a journey back to one of the most intellectually explosive periods in history. We're talking about the 9th and 10th centuries CE.
So that's the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Islamic calendar.
Exactly. And this era was, it was defined by a profound theological identity crisis that really dictated the entire future direction of Sunni Islam. It was an intellectual war zone. And we're going to be looking at the critical architects who, built the fortresses of what would become orthodoxy.
Our mission today is pretty laser-focused. We're exploring this crucial, often overlooked foundational period of Sunni scholastic theology. Scholars now call it proto-Ashṟarism. We're looking at the thinkers who were trying to systematically build these intellectual fortifications before the big name, Abu al-Hasan al-Ashʿarī, arrived to sort of formalize the whole blueprint.
These are the unsung intellectual architects, the ones who laid the groundwork.
Absolutely.
And to really get why they were so necessary, you have to appreciate the sheer dichotomy of the intellectual landscape at the time. You had two theological behemoths just clashing with maximum intensity. On one side, you had mutazilism.
The rationalists.
The ultimate rationalists, yeah. They were driven by kalam, or speculative theology, and their philosophical commitments were, they were total. They believed God's justice, and his injunctions were entirely accessible and often discernible through rigorous human reason or aql.
And this commitment to reason, it led them to some really, really contentious conclusions. Their most famous position, the one everyone knows, is that the Quran must be created.
Right. Their logic was, look, it exists as specific letters, sounds, ink on a page, all of which are created, temporal things.
So the book itself must be created.
It has to be. For them, saying the Quran was eternal would compromise God's absolute uniqueness, his eternal nature. It would undermine the whole concept of tawhid.
Okay, so that's one side. Who is on the other?
Directly opposing them were the Atharites, or the traditionalists. Their stronghold was often the Hanbali school of law and thought. And for them, speculative theology, kalam, was just a wicked innovation. It was a foreign tool that contaminated pure faith.
So their approach was much simpler.
Extremely simple. Reject all philosophical speculation, condemn any theological debate, and stick exclusively to the literal interpretation, the athar of the Quran and Sunnah. No questions asked.
Wow. That sounds like an impossible situation. The rationalists had the methodology, but they reached conclusions that traditionalists found just abhorrent. But the traditionalists, they had the piety, but they lacked a systematic, defensible argument against the rationalists' pretty sophisticated logic.
You're putting your finger right on the crisis. There was a desperate need for a mediating force, someone to use the tools of reason to actually defend the conclusions of revelation.
And that's where our group comes in.
That is the perfect setup for the Kullābiyya school, the true genesis of proto-Ashṟarism. Our sources point directly to them: Ibn Kullāb, al-Harith, al-Muḥāsibī, and al-Qalānisī. These are the thinkers who began the frankly dangerous work of systematically using the rational methods of the Mu'tazila to defend the doctrinal conclusions of the traditionalists.
So they were building the road that al-Ashʿarī would later walk down.
They paved the exact road, doctrine by doctrine. The connection is direct. Our sources confirm that al-Ashʿarī, who died in 936 CE, explicitly modeled his whole approach on the work of Ibn Kullāb, who came decades before him.
So the Kullābi school isn't just a precursor. It's really the original pivotal school that created the philosophical language Ashʿarism later spoke.
That's it. So we're really examining the true theological architects today. Ibn Kullāb, the guy who originated the systematic doctrines on God's essence and speech, then al-Harith al-Muḥāsibī, who brought this theology inward, merging it with spiritual ethics.
And al-Qalānisī.
And Abu Abbas al-Qalānisī, who sort of maintained and elaborated on these views, ensuring that the lineage continued right up to the point where al-Ashʿarī school would start to dominate.
Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with the central figure who seems to have provided the intellectual infrastructure, Ibn Kullāb.
Abdullah b. Said al-Qattan al-Basri al-Tamimi. The sources really identify him as the leading scholar who systematically began to structure Sunni theology during that turbulent first half of the 9th century in Baghdad.
And what's so fascinating is his background, right? Where did he come from?
Well, this is what makes his contribution so compelling. He began firmly within the traditionalist camp. He belonged to a group known as the Nawabit.
So he was one of them initially.
Exactly. He was a man of tradition. But he was intellectually honest enough to realize that just citing scripture wasn't a sufficient defense against the sophisticated Mu'tazili rationalism that held sway. He knew he had to become a mutakallim, a philosophical theologian, to tackle the core problems head-on.
The big three, so to speak.
The big three. The doctrine of divine attributes, Sifat, the nature of Tawhid, God's oneness, and the explosive issue of God's speech, Kalam.
So his goal was to build a framework that affirmed what Revelation said about God, but in a way that the Mu'tazila couldn't just dismantle with their logic.
That's it. Which brings us straight to his core contribution, the divine attributes.
Okay, so what was the philosophical tight spot here? Why was this so difficult?
Well, the Mu'tazila rejected eternal attributes, things like God's eternal knowledge or his power or his will. They feared that saying these attributes existed eternally alongside God's essence, or dot, would imply there were multiple distinct eternal entities.
Which would compromise God's oneness.
Exactly. For them, affirming eternal attributes compromised Tawhid. So they insisted the attributes had to be identical to the essence itself. God doesn't have knowledge, he is knowledge.
And the traditionalists, on the other hand, just affirmed them literally, which left them open to charges of anthropomorphism, or at least failing to answer that philosophical challenge.
You've got it. So Ibn Kullāb had to forge a new path. He had to protect the traditionalist reverence for attributes while rigorously maintaining monotheism. And he stepped into this philosophical minefield with this incredibly precise, systematic position. He argued that God's attributes, the sifat, are neither the same nor different from his essence. Neither the same nor different. That phrase sounds on the surface like a contradiction. Let's really drill down on why that distinction was so necessary. What did he achieve with that?
It was a brilliant linguistic strategy to carve out a unique ontological space. Think about it. If the attributes were exactly the same as the essence, they'd be redundant.
Right. Knowledge would just be being. Power would just be being. They wouldn't mean anything.
They wouldn't fulfill their descriptive function from the Quran. But if they were entirely different, they'd be separate co-eternal substances, which is exactly the problem the Mu'tazila were worried about. That violates monotheism. So by saying neither, Ibn Kullāb is essentially saying that the relationship between God's essence and his attributes is unique. It's super rational. It's unlike anything in our created world.
Precisely. The attributes are inherent to God's being. They are real eternal characteristics, but they are not separate entities that compete with the divine essence for existence.
That's monumental. It provides the philosophical language to affirm all the scriptural descriptions of God. He is all-hearing, all-seeing, knowing without falling into the trap of anthropomorphism on one side or destroying Tawhid on the other.
And this systematic emphasis on the reality of the sifat directly countered the Mu'tazili denial. It became the bedrock for all subsequent systematic Sunni theology.
And this same precision, I assume, he applied directly to the single most politically charged issue of the time, the doctrine of God's eternal speech. You mentioned the Miḥna, the Inquisition, where scholars were jailed and tortured over this. What were the existential stakes?
The stakes were identity. It was everything. The Mu'tazila's argument was powerful. If God's word is composed of physical letters, sounds, ink, how can it be eternal? It must be created, like any other physical thing.
While the traditionalists insisted it was uncreated. They feared that if God's word was temporal, then God himself was somehow incomplete or silent before he created the word.
It was a theological impasse. They needed a way out that honored both the text and the reality of the physical world, and Ibn Kullāb vigorously rejected the Mu'tazila's doctrine of a created Quran.
So how did he do it? How did he navigate the physical reality of sounds and letters versus the eternal nature of God?
He established this pivotal idea that God's kalam, his speech, is at its core an eternal internal attribute residing solely in God's thought. This is the famous concept of kalam nasi, or mental speech, or internal speech.
So it's an attribute just like God's knowledge or his power. It's eternal and uncreated.
Yes. And here is the crucial distinction he brought to the forefront. The kalam nafsi is the uncreated internal meaning.
A meaning, okay.
The actual words, the letters, the syntax, the physical sounds that we recite or hear, what is sometimes called kalam lafshi, or uttered speech. He argued that all of that is merely the created expression or the indication of that eternal internal attribute.
So the container is created, but the content is uncreated.
Beautifully put. The container is created, but the content, the meaning, the divine attribute of speech itself is uncreated.
That is an incredible theological maneuver. It provides the perfect philosophical basis for the Sunni consensus. The Quran, as the actual word and meaning of God, is uncreated. That solves the Mu'tazili challenge.
But it also accommodates the undeniable fact that the physical book, the recitation, the manifestation in our world is a created phenomenon. It's performed by human agents.
It was a masterstroke of reconciliation. Ibn Kullāb gave the traditionalists a vocabulary of defense. He made it possible for them to affirm their creed, that the Quran is the uncreated word of God, without falling into a logical contradiction.
And that achievement secured a core tenet of traditionalism against its most dangerous philosophical critique.
So that moves us perfectly onto our second key figure, al-Muḥāsibī. If Ibn Kullāb was the systematic organizer of external attributes, it seems like al-Muḥāsibī provided the movement with its psychological and ethical depth. He was a contemporary of Ibn Kullāb, dying just a few years later in 857 CE.
Al-Muḥāsibī is noted in our sources for a singular pioneering achievement. He was one of the very first figures to successfully combine Sufism, Tasawwuf, and Kalam, speculative theology.
Which, as you said, seems normal to us today, thanks to later figures. But at the time, that was radical.
Oh, highly radical and controversial in the 9th century. It's easy to forget how distinct those two trends were early on. The early mutakallimūn could be seen as, overly intellectual, dry, while early Sufis often viewed all that theological speculation as a distraction from pure asceticism and devotion.
So why did Muḥāsibī risk this synthesis? What was he trying to achieve?
I think he realized that Kalam provided necessary intellectual clarity, but that clarity was useless without ethical application and spiritual discipline. He sought to create a disciplined, reflective spiritual life, tasawwuf, that was also intellectually sound, based in Kalam.
So he was laying the philosophical groundwork for a kind of internalized, intellectually defensible faith.
Yes, his work directly anticipated later foundational figures like al-Ghazali, who centuries later would solidify this merger as the norm. Muḥāsibī was on the front lines.
And we get a great glimpse into this through his work, The Quintessence of the Intellect and Its Meaning. It focuses heavily on epistemology and the primacy of intellect, or occasionalism. He wasn't just defending God's nature, he was defending the human need for deep, transformative thinking.
He fundamentally stresses the vital importance of reflection, contemplation, and sound reasoning. For Muḥāsibī, these activities are not peripheral. They are absolutely essential for augmenting one's knowledge, for raising a person's moral status, and most importantly, for avoiding the danger of ignorance.
It sounds like he's arguing against a more superficial kind of learning, maybe the rote memorization that was common among some traditionalist scholars.
He issues a sharp critique of that very approach. He asks this direct question, he says, of what use is the knowledge of one who has only studied knowledge with his tongue and memorized its words with his heart, but avoided reflecting, contemplating, and thinking about its meanings and extracting its benefits?
Wow.
He warns that a scholar like that is spiritually deficient. They possess only the shell of knowledge, but none of the wisdom inside.
That's a demanding standard. The raw data of revelation has to be processed and internalized by the intellect to become truly meaningful.
And this intellectual processing has a direct and immediate ethical application. Muḥāsibī saw the intellect as the moral mechanism. It's the internal compass that allows you to differentiate between what's truly beneficial and what's genuinely harmful. It gives you the power you need to resist the temptations of your base nature, the nafs.
This link between spiritual health and intellectual rigor is captured so well in his famous comparison, which kind of synthesizes his whole program.
It really does, he says. The pleasure of the wise scholars is in their intellects, and the pleasure of the ignoramuses and beasts is in their desires.
It's a profound theological summation.
It is. He's linking spiritual happiness, achieving the spirit of certainty, directly to intellectual discipline. Sound reasoning, long thinking, continuous reflection. The goal is knowledge of God, and that can only be achieved by using your intellect to engage deeply with revelation and to struggle with yourself, muhasaba, to recognize what truly pleases God.
But despite all this intense piety and intellectual depth, this combination of kalam and this focus on internalized states, it did not go over well with the established guard. We have to talk about the severe historical conflict and the traditionalist pushback that Muḥāsibī faced.
This point is absolutely central to understanding the proto-Ashārite struggle. Despite Muḥāsibī's recognized Sufi piety, his willingness to use kalam, the very same tools that would form the core of Ashārism, earned him extremely harsh verdicts from his traditionalist contemporaries.
And the primary voice of opposition was the towering figure of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal.
The one and only.
Why such intense animosity? I mean, Muḥāsibī was fundamentally defending the same theological conclusions as Ibn Hanbal. He was just using a different method.
And for Ibn Hanbal and the hardline traditionalists, the method was everything. They viewed the methodology of kalam itself as an unacceptable innovation, a bilā. It was a pathway to heresy, regardless of the piety of the person using it or the orthodoxy of their conclusions.
So just to engage in rational debate about God's attributes was inherently suspect.
Inherently suspect. So Muḥāsibī was caught between two worlds. He was too traditional for the Mu'tazila and way too intellectual for the traditionalists.
And what was the practical consequence of Ibn Hanbal's condemnation? It must have been severe.
The outcome was marginalization. The condemnation was so potent that the sources indicate Muḥāsibī was basically shunned in Baghdad, the center of intellectual life. He reportedly was forced to teach his disciples in secret, and very few people attended his funeral, despite his stature.
Wow.
It just illustrates his enormous tension. The proto-Ashārites were desperately trying to defend tradition, but they were being condemned by their own peers, the very people they were trying to protect, simply for adopting a rational methodology. It took generations for this middle position to gain the institutional legitimacy it needed.
Okay, now we have to transition to what is arguably the most complex and persistent philosophical problem in early Islamic theology, one the Kullāb had to address to make their whole system work: divine action and justice, and specifically the doctrine of acquisition, kasb.
Right. This is the eternal philosophical problem of free will versus determinism, al-jabr wa al-ikhtiyar. The entire theological structure rests on how you reconcile God's absolute power and omniscience with the reality of human responsibility.
If God knows and wills everything, how can I be held responsible for my sins?
That's the question. And we know the Mu'tazili viewpoint. God's justice required humans to be the true creators of their own acts. Otherwise, punishing them for sins God predetermined them to commit would be inherently unjust.
But the proto-Ashārites couldn't accept that.
Absolutely not. They were absolute in upholding the universality of divine will. Nothing happens outside God's decree in creation. So they needed a doctrine that affirmed the traditionalist reading of God's omnipotence. But you do not wish unless it is wished by Allah, while still maintaining human accountability for heaven and hell.
And this forced them to rely on the doctrine of acquisition, kasb. How does kasb manage to bridge this profound gap between God's universal creation and human choice?
So the Kullāb doctrine asserts that all human acts, moving your hand, speaking a word, thinking a thought, are utterly and absolutely Allah's creation. God creates the entire act, the power to do it, and its effect in the world.
Okay, so where does the human come in?
The human agent, however, has the acquisition, the kasb of that act.
That distinction is highly technical. What does acquisition actually entail? If God creates the act, what is the human doing?
The human agent contributes the internal, consciously intended volition, the quast. The act is brought about through a power created by Allah in the agent at the very moment of action. Crucially, the human agent's intention and their capacity, which is also created by God, coincides with God's creation of the act.
Okay, let me see if I get this. The human provides the conscious direction and intention, and because that intention is present, they acquire moral responsibility for the act that God ultimately creates. It shifts the burden of accountability from the creation of the act to the locus of its intended performance.
That is the tightrope walk. The act is God's creation, but it becomes the human agent's act in some unspecified way through this mechanism of acquisition. This is the only way they could reconcile God's absolute status as the sole creator, the Khaliq, with the theological requirement of human accountability.
I can see the philosophical necessity, but I can also see why critics found it so obscure. The sources mentioned that other Sunni theologians, like the Maturidiyya, often call the Ash'arites determinists or mujbira. Why did that criticism stick so hard?
The criticism came down to the timing and nature of that created power. The Maturidists, while they agreed that God creates the act, they emphasized that humans must possess a genuine prior power of choice, an ETR, that exists before the act is committed. That gives the choice real freedom.
But for the Ash'ars,
the Ash'ari insistence that the human capacity is created by God only at the moment of action. This mere coincidence of the act with the agent's will led critics to feel this wasn't enough to establish true freedom. They saw the human as just a passive vessel for God's continuous creation.
it's the difference between having the capacity to choose before you choose versus only having the capacity to acquire the act when God creates it. That's a massive technical division.
It is. And this distinction became one of the central debates between the two major schools of Sunni kalam for centuries. The Kullābi framework established kasb as the necessary solution, but its technical definition proved controversial even among their allies.
Before we move to the legacy, we need to firmly anchor our third foundational figure, Abu al-Abbas al-Qalānisī. He's often mentioned as the bridge to al-Ashʿarī, but what was his independent significance?
Al-Qalānisī is vital. He lived into al-Ashāri's mature period, dying around 966 CE, and he confirms the direct, continuous, and independent existence of the Kullābi school. He wasn't just a student of Ibn Kullāb, but a true intellectual successor who elaborated on the original doctrines.
And his importance is confirmed by later scholarship that specifically compared his views to al-Ashāri's.
Precisely. Works like the Itilaf al-Shaykhain, The Disagreement of the Two Sheikhs, written by the later Ashārite systematizer Ibn Furak, meticulously documented the points of contention between al-Qalānisī and al-Ashārī. This proves al-Qalānisī was a robust, influential theologian in his own right.
So his views were influential enough that they needed to be explicitly refuted or reconciled by the rising Ashārite school. Can you give us an example of a disagreement, something that shows his independent thought?
Sure. While they both agreed on the core Kullābi doctrines of sifat and kalam nafsi, they differed on finer points of physics and ontology. For instance, they debated the relationship between the constituent parts of matter, the atoms or jawahir, and their accidental properties, the arad. These technical disagreements highlight that al-Qalānisī was actively developing and testing the Kullābi framework.
So proto-Ashřarism was a vibrant, evolving tradition, not just a static historical precursor.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've established the foundation. Ibn Kullāb's systematic attributes, Muḥāsibī's marriage of intellect and ethics, and the complex doctrine of kasb. Now let's discuss the eventual triumph and al-Ashāri's debt to his precursors.
Well, al-Ashāri's success was his ability to integrate and formalize this entire body of work into a cohesive, widely disseminated system. He had the luxury of synthesizing the debates that the Kullābi had fought piecemeal and often under persecution.
He inherited the conceptual language, the neither the same nor different, the kalam nafsi.
All of it, directly from Ibn Kullāb. In essence, the Kullābi did the heavy lifting of intellectual defense, and al-Ashārī provided the finalized, standardized textbook that was needed for institutional recognition.
The ultimate aim was the same.
Exactly the same.
Yeah.
Use the rational methods of kalam, learned from the Mu'tazila, to defend the established tenets of the traditionalist creed. It was a strategic, methodical assimilation of the opponent's tools for orthodox defense.
But as you mentioned, the sources reveal that even after al-Ashāri's death, the school was far from complete. It was still pretty fragmented.
That's a critical historical nuance that often gets lost. Al-Ashārī was a prolific polemicist. He would write refutations, tracts, participate in debates, which means his theological theories were often scattered and incomplete when he died.
And his students maybe didn't help.
Well, his early students sometimes mixed his views with methodologies from other schools, which made it incredibly difficult for a later researcher to pin down what the pure Ash'arite position actually was. The school desperately needed systematization.
Which brings us to the figure who truly transformed the legacy, Abu Bakr ibn Furak, and the systematization of Ash'arism by later scholars.
Ibn Furak, who died in 1015 CE, is the critical figure in this second generation. Researchers credit him with taking this scattered set of arguments and transforming them into the standardized, independent, dialectical theological system we recognize today. His book, Mujarrad Maqalat al-Shaykh Abu al-Hasan al-Ashʿarī, was groundbreaking.
The epitome of the sayings of Shaykh Abu al-Hasan al-Ashʿarī. What was his method? How did he bring order out of that chaos?
He was like a theological archivist and detective. He reviewed all of al-Ashʿarī's writings and debates. His goal was to rigorously distinguish al-Ashʿarī's confirmed personal views from the interpretations of his students, especially where they disagreed.
So he wasn't just collecting quotes. He was systematizing the entire framework.
And he did it by often relying heavily on the foundational Kullābiyya principles that al-Ashʿarī himself had adopted. He was building a rigorous scholarly method for the future.
And this sounds like an enormous scholarly undertaking, especially given the intense political opposition the school still faced.
Incredibly difficult. The sources note several reasons for their initial struggles. The continuing political power of the rival traditionalist Hanbalis in Baghdad, who still saw Kalam as heresy. And there was strong animosity and direct persecution from external opponents like the al-Karamiya dynasty in Khorasan.
And the cost of this effort was tragically high for Ibn Furak himself. This wasn't just an academic struggle.
No, it was a matter of life and death. That is the ultimate high-stakes reminder. Ibn Furak's work transformed al-Ashʿarī's scattered ideas into a strong, competitive school. This success brought him into direct, violent conflict with powerful rivals. Our sources explicitly state that Ibn Furak was eventually killed by his opponents, specifically the al-Karamiya.
Because of his efforts to revive and transform the school.
Yes. His death just underscores the intense hostility the proto-Ashʿarites and their successors faced in establishing their middle way. It provides a necessary narrative tension, reminding us that these abstract theological arguments were, for the people involved, existential struggles.
And ultimately, the framework established by the proto-Ashřarites, initiated by Ibn Kullāb and codified by figures like Ibn Furak, enabled Ashřarism to achieve this extraordinary predominance.
It did. It became, alongside the maturity school, the mainstream theological school reflecting Sunni belief. Its success was secured by attracting distinguished scholars from various schools of law, especially the Shafis, ensuring its survival, its institutionalization, and its ultimate dominance across the Muslim world.
We've covered a vast, complex intellectual landscape today, spanning the entire evolution of proto-Ashřarism. To quickly recap our key insights, we saw Ibn Kullāb introduce the systematic theological language that allowed traditional belief to affirm divine attributes and the uncreated nature of God's word through kalam-nafsi.
We then encountered al-Harith al-Muḥāsibī, who pioneered that crucial fusion of intellectual kalam and ethical Sufism, insisting on the primacy of the intellect, the aqwal, for deep reflection, even though this radical synthesis earned him the bitter scorn of the traditionalists.
And finally, we detailed the necessity of the doctrine of acquisition, or kasb, as the proto-Ashřarite solution for reconciling God's universal creation with human moral responsibility, showing that accountability lies in the human agent's acquisition of the divinely created act.
The final result of all this tireless intellectual work is that proto-Ashřarism created the essential philosophical and ethical structure necessary for traditional belief to survive and thrive against the rigorous rationalist critique of the Mu'tazila. They defended the Sunnah using the tools of reason.
So what's the final provocative thought to leave with the listener who has navigated this deep dive with us?
I think we see in figures like Ibn Kullāb and al-Muḥāsibī this early high-stakes example of intellectual adaptation in the face of a philosophical crisis. When a tradition is confronted by what seems to be a superior rational method, the Mu'tazili column, the community splits. The question becomes, is long-term success achieved by strictly rejecting all foreign philosophical tools as the Ashřarites demanded, or by strategically adopting those methods like the Kullābiyya did to ultimately defend revelation?
Even if it means facing harsh criticism from your own side.
Even if it means risking severe criticism and, as history showed with Ibn Furak, even death. This process of controversial synthesis, this willingness to use logic to defend the literal texts, fundamentally shaped and secured the intellectual, spiritual, and legal history of the entire Muslim world. It forces you to consider the long-term benefit of controversial intellectual engagement versus the perceived safety of pure textual rejection.